Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our free Thursday webinar. I'm Nikki Jovicic from Lookupstrata and I'm also the Managing Director of Tower Body Corporate, and today I'm your host. We're navigating the world of strata politics, and I think this will be a really excellent session, and we're very happy that you've chosen to join us today. Strata living can often present unique challenges, so understanding the intricacies and policies in your building is crucial. Whether you're a long-serving committee member or a lot owner looking to get more involved, this webinar is designed to provide you with the knowledge and tools needed to effectively represent your interests within the strata scheme. Chris Irons, Director of Strata Solve, brings a wealth of experience and unparalleled insights to you today. With his deep understanding of the strata landscape, Chris will share his invaluable knowledge and practical advice to help you get just what you want. You'll learn how to navigate the often complex world of committee elections and strategically manoeuvre to achieve your goals. And Chris will also equip you with the skills to craft compelling motions and effectively campaign for your desired outcomes at the next AGM. So by the end of this session, you'll have a clear understanding of how to maximise your influence within your body corporate, and hopefully that's for good, not evil, and drive positive change in your community. Now, this is a national session today, and with inclusivity in mind, we're aware that terminology does change across Australia. So when we're talking about committees, that's also known as the Strata Council or Council of Owners. And when Chris mentions body corporate, that's also the Owners Corporation or the Strata Company, depending on what state you're from. So before we begin, I'd like to mention that the information in this session, including discussions arising from submitted questions and from chat conversations, is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as advice. And you should seek independent advice before acting on the information contained in all of our sessions. Now, we welcome back today Chris Irons from Strata Solve. Did you know that there's only one body corporate commissioner in the world, and for over 5 years that was Chris Irons? Chris is a thought leader for the strata sector. He provides a unique perspective on solving body corporate issues, and as commissioner, Chris saw and heard just about everything in strata, so he's rarely surprised by the breadth or type of problems out there. Chris feels there is a solution to every strata problem. He has an honours degree in communications and values the importance of the right words and language in strata situations. He combines these experiences in trying to resolve strata issues and give parties confidence without the need for legal proceedings. Chris is a trained mediator, a well-known public speaker and media commentator on strata issues, and he speaks at strata conferences and forums Australia-wide and works with related industry sectors such as the real estate sector. So welcome back, Chris. It's really great to have you with us again today for this fantastic topic.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, everybody. I think I would speak for you, Nikki, when I say that we all know that there's lots of demands on time. We also know that there are lots of places that you could potentially seek out some strata assistance or information. So the fact that you would choose to spend a bit of time with us, grateful for the fact that you do so, whether you're watching this live or whether you're watching a replay of it later on. Get what you want. I really like this topic. I like every topic that I present on Lookupstrata, but I especially like this one because this isn't about section blah, blah, says blah, blah, about blah, blah. This is actually stepping back and thinking a little sideways, if you like, or a little laterally about what goes on in your strata scheme. And regardless of whether you're an owner or a committee member or a manager or a caretaker or other practitioner, this is relevant to you because this is about getting the outcome that you are seeking. The art of persuasion, lobbying. I'm going to go through some of the essential, what I think are the essential parts of lobbying. I don't think there's any, as far as I'm aware anyway, there's not a particular standard around lobbying, and it's certainly not something that the legislators have often turned their minds to. So let's try and put some substance around it for everybody and see where we get to. All right, first up, Nikki's already touched upon this, but my disclaimer as well, I'm not a legal practitioner. There are plenty of excellent strata lawyers out there for you to get strata legal advice from, if that's what you would like. I'm also not a psychologist, so whenever I talk about human behaviour in this kind of webinar, I'm not offering clinical advice. I'm offering some observations about people. Let's start off by defining our terms. I think everybody might have a slightly different view of what we mean by lobbying. So I'm going to try and put some substance around that one. Here's a definition for you to think of first up. An attempt to influence the decision-making of a government or opposition representative in the exercise of their official functions on behalf of a third party for a fee or other reward. Now, this is taken direct from the website of the Office of the Queensland Integrity Commissioner. I suspect there are similar definitions of lobbying in other states and territories from other similar offices in those states and territories. You look at that definition and you see there are parts of it there that perhaps are not entirely relevant to what we're talking about. We're not talking about government or opposition representative, for example, but there are certainly parts of this definition I think are really relevant to Strata. An attempt to influence the decision-making. I think that's key here. So let's hang on to that as something we're talking about. The exercise of their official functions. I think that can also be relevant. That's especially relevant for committee functions and committee operations. On behalf of a third party for fee or other rewards. Sometimes lobbying in Strata is done by the individuals. It's not being done on behalf of anybody else, and you're doing it yourself, so you don't get a third party to do it, and there's not necessarily a fee or other reward. So maybe that's not quite as relevant. So taking into account all of that, I'd probably synthesize lobbying down to this relatively simple definition. We're talking about persuasion at the end of the day, whether for or against something or someone. So we are trying to persuade, when we talk about lobbying in Strata, we're trying to persuade someone to vote for something, we're trying to persuade someone to not vote for something, or we are trying to persuade towards someone or away from someone, or to a concept or away from a concept. So that when we talk about lobbying, let's use that as our benchmark. I want to bust a few lobbying myths first up. Number one, you can't do it. I've had this put to me numerous times by numerous people, clients, in webinars and seminars, and they will say to me something like, surely other people can't just slip a letter under my door or send me an email without my permission. Surely that's not permitted. Yes, it is permitted. Well, certainly not prohibited. Let's put it that way. So the idea that you cannot attempt to persuade and attempt to encourage support for your position in Strata, the idea that somehow that's not allowed, no, that's not the case. So that's the first myth I want to bust. And then there's this one. It's crass. It's ugly. It's uncultured. It's uncouth. I've certainly had that commentary as well. And I kind of get it. I had a client body corporate not so long ago for whom I was doing some lobbying work. And we were talking about organising a town hall forum. And they asked me not to call it a town hall forum because they thought that that was overly American. Okay. So we called it an information session or an information night, I think what it was. For some people, the idea that you're going to go out there and advocate for what you want in a Strata scheme seems unethical or crass or ugly or unpleasant. That's a really subjective kind of pejorative thing. And I guess it's not really my place to comment on whether something is subjective or ethical or not. But let's put it this other way, and I think this makes a lot more sense putting it this way. If you've spent $750,000 or $1 million, probably, or more in the current property market on purchasing your lot, is it crass or unethical to go out there and do what you need to do to enhance the value of that investment? I don't think it is. And that's why I wouldn't agree necessarily, even though I respect the idea that some people think it's crass, I don't agree that it is. And this one, I get this one occasionally as well. It's only Strata. Oh, it's very silly to lobby. It's very silly to try and persuade. It's just Strata. It's just voting. It's just, again, it's very closely related to the previous point. If you take that view, well, fine, take that view. But I think that this is a far more significant thing. This is a far more business-based prospect. It's not just only Strata. It's significantly more than that. And then these two things, it'll never work and there's no point. That comes up a lot. Oh, Chris, there's no point in lobbying. Everybody is set in their ways. I'll never be able to persuade them. They're set. Nothing will change. Well, my response to that is twofold. First of all, if you're going to start from that position and that mindset, well, of course, nothing will change because you are not open to the prospect of it. But the second thing to remember is that things change all the time. The people who are owners now or on the committee now may not be there in 6 months' time. Or circumstances change, or the environment change, or people's views change. It happens all the time. And if you've tried everything else to get something that you want and it hasn't worked, then would it not make sense to try this as something that you haven't done? So the idea that it can't work and there's no point, I cannot and will not accept that. Here are some of the key lobbying mistakes I think people make. First one, poor planning, not knowing what the timing is. If it's about influencing a vote at a general meeting, not having a concept of when the general meeting is, or not having a concept of when the papers go out, not having a concept of who the people are, who the owners are, who they need to reach out to, not thinking about the bigger picture, just going a bull at a gate, not mapping it out in advance. And then this one, no focus or clarity, having a message that doesn't really make a lot of sense, or it's confused, or it's not on point, or not being clear about what it is that you're trying to achieve, or instead of articulating something in a single paragraph, articulating it over 5 to 10 pages. If your message is not focused or not clear, people will not be able to engage with it, and you will have lost the attempt to persuade and influence. And this one, getting personal in the lobbying. Remember that you're trying to maintain a business-like approach to this kind of thing. You're trying to approach Strata as though you're running a business. So when you personalize things, you lose that objectivity and you lose that distance. So it's like that old football analogy where you play the man and not the ball. The same thing applies here. When you play the person as opposed to the issue, then I think that you are distracting from your message, but also you call into question your integrity and your reputation in the process. People will look at you and think you're just getting personal, you're just having a personal attack on that individual, you're not focusing on the issue. Leaving it too late in the process, especially now with electronic voting at meetings. If people get a notice of a meeting, the chances are they're going to vote for it immediately. They just want to get it off their plate and focus on something else. So if you are leaving your attempts to persuade until the day of the meeting, that's way too late, way too late in the process. You need to do things in advance. You need to give time for people to think about things, particularly if what you're presenting is a little controversial or a little sensitive. So yeah, leaving it to the day of the meeting, it's a big no-no, that one. I'm going to try and break down lobbying now into a couple of categories, depending upon who you are and what you are. Let's give this a go. So from the committee perspective, then, when we talk about lobbying, here's generally what we're talking about. So lobbying from a committee perspective, a lot of the time is about getting hard, contentious, controversial things done. So these are perhaps things that need to be done around the scheme or motions that need to be passed, but you know as a committee that they're going to be difficult to pass. For whatever reason. Perhaps it's because it involves a lot of money. Perhaps it is on a really sensitive issue that people feel strongly about one way or the other. Passing a bylaw in relation to pets or smoking would be a pretty decent example of a contentious thing. So the committee knows it's going to be tough work to get something done. So persuasion and lobbying is about trying to get as many people on side so that the contentious thing has a better chance of success. And then very closely related to that is passing high threshold motions. So for some kind of motions, and speaking here from a Queensland perspective, you might have a special resolution or a resolution without dissent. Those are things that require a very high threshold to achieve. And if you've got a handful of people who are predisposed to voting no or not voting at all, then your chances of passing those high threshold motions are reduced very quickly. So what you're trying to do is shore up the numbers, get the numbers right. You know what kind of numbers you need to get something passed. So lobbying is about getting those numbers. Lobbying can be a bit simpler than that, though. Rather than being about a tangible motion or a tangible issue, lobbying can be a form of engagement and communication, and that's really useful for a couple of ways from a committee perspective. First and foremost, it can demonstrate to owners and to the broader scheme that the committee is doing its job, that it is out there listening to people, getting their views, and hearing what they've got to say. In some cases, using lobbying as an engagement and communications exercise can also be very useful if there is a dispute later on in the process. And I have seen adjudication orders in Queensland where the fact that the committee have held an information session or a town hall forum in advance of a vote is something that committee can then rely upon later as a response to an owner who said, well, I didn't know about this, or I didn't understand the issue. The fact that a committee can hold a session with owners can be relied upon in that case. And that's effectively what I've mentioned a couple of times already, the town hall forum or the information session. So that's something that I've done for a number of clients now. And I'll give you a de-identified example of that. So I was engaged by a committee about a painting issue that they had. So this was a scheme where it was a number of townhouses and standalone, a kind of freestanding townhouses and villas. It was time for the exteriors to be painted. The committee had gotten a project manager and a painting contractor, but they needed owners to sign up for it so that it could all be done at the same time. So you didn't have the situation where each individual owner was out there with scaffolding at different times, doing painting at different times. And there was also an economic benefit to the committee to getting a number of owners signed up. But some owners were dragging the chain and some owners were just avoiding engaging with it at all. So they engaged me for the town hall forum and I went out to the scheme. I think it was a Saturday afternoon, actually. And we held our town hall forum by the swimming pool at the scheme. So we had owners come along, they brought chairs, they sat down and we just had a talk. The owners asked a lot of questions, the committee members gave responses, I gave responses. A lot of it focused on the benefits. Why is it a good idea to get this painting done now? What will it mean for your property values? And then there are also some more, I guess, testy parts of it as well. Well, what are the consequences if I don't do it? And so we were able to talk about things like uniformity of appearance and bylaws about appearance. We finished up the session, went for an hour, and then a couple of weeks later, the committee rep I've been dealing with got back to me and said, we've achieved our minimum number now for the painting contract. We got people signing up after that info session. So that's an example of how lobbying and persuasion got the committee the outcome it wanted to achieve. And there's lots of other examples I could give you on that one. Let's talk about lobbying from the perspective of a caretaker, and people might know caretakers as on-site managers or management rights holders, and indeed strata managers. I'll lump them into the same category for the purposes of this discussion. So how can lobbying be useful in your situation? Well, first up, it might be very useful for a contract extension or enhancement. So on the topic of enhancement in Queensland in particular, we have a scenario where management rights holders seek what's called a top-up to their contract. So lobbying can be very useful to get out there and seek owner support for the purposes of having that passed at a general meeting. Lobbying, though, can be a really good way of alleviating a bit of pressure if you're in this category. So if things are a bit tense at the scheme between you and the committee or you and somebody else at the committee, and you just want to alleviate pressure, the ability to go out there and engage with people through lobbying or persuasion, through communication with owners, to put out a positive message about the work that you do and what you are achieving for the scheme. When I do this sort of work with caretakers, I always say to them, emphasise the positives. What things have you done lately around the scheme in relation to maintenance or engaging contractors that have really added to the scheme? It's a good way of alleviating that pressure. It's also a way of building up a few alliances as well. So again, if you're new or you've had a few issues, going out there and lobbying is a way of identifying who you might have in your corner moving forward in these situations. Bear in mind, though, that in Queensland in particular, and I can only speak from a Queensland perspective, there are a couple of legislative limitations on the lobbying process for a management rights holder or a strata manager. Legislation actually has changed from May of this year to say that a management rights holder or strata manager cannot unfairly influence the outcome of a motion. Remember, though, that while you cannot unfairly, you can fairly influence the outcome. So while there is a bit of a limitation, it's not an outright prohibition necessarily. And here's something for everyone to think about in this category of lobbying. Just because you can do it doesn't mean that you should do it. So just so the ability to lobby is there, is it a good idea? You've got to remember that once you are seen to be throwing your allegiances behind a certain people, or that you've obtained support from a certain category at the scheme, that may then set some factions at the scheme moving forward, and people tend to have long memories. I'll give you an example of a success in this category, and also on that point, I was engaged by management rights holders here in Brisbane. They were having some issues with one specific committee member. They'd tried a few communications techniques. It looked like that was working, and then it stopped working. And actually, things got worse very quickly. So they said to me, right, we actually want to proceed now to make sure that that committee member gets voted off at the next AGM. So away we went with our campaign. I drafted a letter with them. I gave them some speaking points to use. They went out there. They went through their networks. They canvassed for support. We got to the AGM. Last item at an AGM is always the election of a committee in Queensland. I suspect that's the same everywhere else. They got what they wanted. The person that they didn't want on the committee was voted off. My clients were ecstatic, really, really happy. But I came away from it wondering if that was actually the end of the story for them. Was that really the right course of action? I was glad I'd achieved it for them, but was it actually going to solve the longer term problem? That's still a watch and see. All right, let's keep going. So from the owner perspective then, when we talk about lobbying, lobbying is useful for getting approval for requests. So you're wanting to make an improvement. Improvement is the technical term in Queensland used for renovation, effectively. So you want to make an improvement to common property. You'll need approval of owners at a general meeting. It might be something like putting a condenser, an air conditioning condenser on common property. If you want approval for that, you're going to need it to get passed by all owners. So you might go out there and campaign for that, especially if it's a really high value improvement where you've got a lot of money and your property values might be affected by that. One of the main ones when we talk about lobbying from an owner perspective is where you want to change and remove committee membership. I've got several clients at the moment where I'm actually working with them on that one. That might be at an AGM, or it might be after an AGM where you actually seek to do the removal via an ordinary resolution in Queensland. Lobbying can also be about gathering support for something as well. So I had a client who had some concerns about a bylaw about apparent use of the pool at their scheme. So they used lobbying as a way to go out there and talk to other owners about their concerns and just try and elicit whether or not other people felt the same way. And they actually found out that other people did feel the same way. So that then gave them confidence to move forward with the next steps in the process. And very similar, lobbying is about raising awareness. So if it's an owner, you have an issue that you feel really strongly about, lobbying and persuasion is a way of raising awareness about that. And there can be various things. Electric vehicle charging might be a good example of that. If there is something that you really want to see happen at your strata scheme, and it's not necessarily about a vote or about a person, but it's something that you want to see happen, lobbying is about raising awareness for that. And I'll leave you with this point, owners. You need to make yourself known. So I think the worst thing you can do when you're lobbying as an owner is to write to another owner and just launch into a spiel about why you want them to do something. You need to introduce yourself. If you don't know every owner, or you don't know every owner well, you need to make the effort to position yourself in the first instance. So my name is John Smith. I'm from Lot 10. I've lived here for 10 years. And today I'm writing to you because you've got to remember that there are some people who will not like you approaching it this way, even though you're perfectly entitled to do it, and will resent it really heavily that you have done so. So effectively, you need to introduce yourself and then you need to launch into your message. That's my view in most situations, everywhere, anyway. Let's talk about the specific issue then of lobbying for strata elections. So this is the point at which strata and politics becomes intertwined and inexorably intertwined at that. So lobbying at elections can be about promoting yourself, or it's about promoting someone else. So you might be putting yourself up for election, or you have an associate or someone whose opinion or input you really value, and you are promoting them to be on the committee. Sometimes you might be promoting a number of people to go onto the committee. This is a good point to think about when we get into election mode. Do you rebut or do you let it go? Whenever you put yourself up for any kind of candidacy, and this is particularly true for a state or a federal election, someone is not going to like it because you are taking focus from somebody else or something else. So someone's not going to like it. And in some cases, people will articulate that negativity. So if you put yourself out there, or you put somebody else out there and promote them for election to the Strata Committee, it is quite possible that someone will respond with negative commentary about you or about the other parties, or will try and suggest that you are not a good candidate for whatever reason. I have a lot of clients and have had a lot of clients who want to go hard on that sort of thing. We need to respond to that. We need to go out there and counter those negative messages, to which my response is, well, do you? Really? Is it really necessary for you to go out there and respond? Remember, when you go out there and you counter a message, all you are doing is opening it up for a further message or a further response at that time. And then you are engaged in this rapid back and forth, tit for tat. People turn off from that sort of thing really quickly. And not only that, your message gets lost in the process. Now, there may be some instances where you do need to rebut, but even so, then there is a particular method for doing that you might want to think about. And remember this outcome, and I've touched upon this before, but I'll say it again. Election outcomes and long memories go hand in hand. Once the election is over, that is not the end of it. People remember and they keep it in mind. So remember that. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. It means that you need to be aware of it and you need to be realistic and you need to be practical, that there might be some long-term implication for you. So then, the lobbying tips. First up, regardless of which category or what you're doing, I think all of these apply. First up, keep your eyes open and keep your expectations real. So keeping your eyes open is what I just said. It's about remembering that some people have long memories, but keep your expectations real. You might not succeed first time around. In fact, a lot of people do not succeed first time around, but that's okay, because you can, even if you do not get what you want the first time, it sets you up for getting it the next time. So you need to get out there, establish yourself, establish your bona fides, and then the next time around, you have a better chance of getting what you want. So keep your expectations real. And then this one, have a clear and singular objective about things. What is it that you are actually trying to achieve? If you say, I just want to get rid of my committee, okay, I literally cannot begin to tell you the number of times somebody has said that phrase to me over the 10 years or so I've been involved in Strata. Got to get rid of the committee. They're terrible, they're hopeless, they're useless. Fine, but what is the actual problem here? And probably in 80 to 90% of instances, it's less about who is on the committee and it's more about how they're making decisions or what the actual issue is. And you might find that there's an entirely different way of achieving your outcome under those circumstances. Number 3, pick your allies. Make sure that you know who it is that you're dealing with and why it is that they are particularly worthwhile in dealing with. Remember, people change their positions all the time, so don't be surprised if your allies change their position all the time. There's that old saying in politics that the only person whose vote you can really trust is the person who says that they're not voting for you. Really important one. If you're asking me to pick which of these is most important, I think it's this one. Get your message right. So when you see politicians on the news, for those of you who watch the news these days, and for those of you who watch politicians, but when you see them, they've got 30 seconds. In fact, they've got probably far less than 30 seconds to get their message across. So when they're standing up there at a door stopper and they've got microphones thrust in their face and they know all they've got is a short grab to get attention. And that's why they fire off with those pithy statements and those things that ring true. Our former Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, was excellent at this. And I'm not casting a comment on his performance one way or another. He was great at it. If you have a go, you'll get a go. What can you say? We all remember that phrase, even if we do not agree with it. That phrase was workshopped, no doubt, with his team of spin doctors and media advisors, and they've rehearsed it. He said it, and then you keep saying it over and over and over. It's the same in Strata. You work out your message, you clarify it, you make it shorter, you make it pithy, because people have really short attention spans, and then you just keep repeating it over and over and over. And number 5, don't go it alone if you don't have to. This kind of work, this kind of thing in Strata can be pretty isolating and a bit lonely as well. And sometimes it's daunting for an individual in particular to think that they have to go out there and try and persuade a whole group of people. I get it. That is daunting. If you're in a big scheme of 100 or 200 lots and you're trying to affect change, the idea that you're going to have to engage with 199 other people, that's confronting. So don't go it alone. Get people in your corner, whether it's friends or family, just people that you can bounce ideas across might be enough. Or get somebody in to help you, whether that's somebody like myself or whomever, it doesn't matter. Don't feel like you have to do this on your own. If something is important enough that you feel like you need to go out there and attempt to persuade and lobby for it, then it should also be the case that you would have a support team behind you. The best politicians are the ones that have a really good support team behind them. That's always the case. It doesn't matter which side of politics. It's always about the people around the politician that make them who they are. The same thing applies here in lobbying. that is the end of my presentation proper. That's me with the Gabba in the background. Go Lions. That's how you can get in touch with me. Nikki, did we have questions?
We certainly do, Chris.
Okay.
As always, we have many questions. Firstly, I would like to say thank you. I thought that was a great presentation, lots and lots of points in there. One of the things that caught my attention right at the very end, you mentioned getting the message right. And that just reminded me of elevator pitches from a business perspective. And I know that if you're in a high rise, residents spend lots of time in the elevator with their fellow neighbours. And so maybe that's not too bad an idea.
Oh, look, that's a great point, Nikki. And even while we're taking the analogy further, let's talk about car park pitches. I think that would be a huge one. So you're down in the basement car park of your high rise. You want something at your strata scheme, and there's that owner that I haven't been able to talk to. Oh, hi, how you doing? I'm blah blah. I'm from blah blah. Hey, look, have you had a chance to look at your AGM materials yet? If not, here's your 10-second pitch. No, probably no more than 30 seconds, I would suggest. So absolutely, Nikki, the elevator pitch or the car park pitch.
How can you lobby? Can you put a pamphlet in letterboxes when you're lobbying for an election? And also, what's the line between lobbying and perceived harassment or bullying or nuisance behaviour?
Okay, let's try and break that down a little bit, Nikki. So I'll only speak from a Queensland legislative position because that's all I can speak from, although I suspect it is probably the same in most jurisdictions. You are entitled to get a copy of the roll of owners in Queensland if you're an owner, and what you do with that roll, there's no legislative restriction on it. The fact that you are given a copy of it means, and it's expected, I think, that you will use it for the purposes of engaging about strata issues. Fine. So away you go. So that means you can email if the email address is on the roll. That means you can post a letter, slip it under the door, or put it in the mailbox. There's no restriction on doing that. For me, the issue arises about how you do that. If you go out there and you put mail in mailboxes and it's a 10-page rant in 8-point font with no line spacing or everything's underlined and bolded, that's absolutely putting people off. Is it harassment or bullying? I don't think it is, actually. But if you use that roll and it's got a phone number on it and you telephone somebody every day, I think that's problematic, absolutely, at that point. So I can't comment on how much constitutes too much because I literally don't know. And my understanding is it's not prescribed in legislation, but you've got to be sensible about this. You've got to be sensible and you've got to be reasonable. And not only that, you've got to put yourself in the shoes of the other party. So if it was me, would I want that happening to me? If the answer is no, then that's your answer as well about what to do and what not to do. One other critical point in this is you need to be careful about being factual. So if you go out there and you say, John Smith from Unit 10 would be a great candidate for the committee because I know John has a Bachelor of Business and has spent 30 years working for BHP. Okay, that's factual. We can verify that probably from LinkedIn. But if you go out there and you say, well, I understand that John Smith was bankrupt 10 years ago and is a bit casual with money, that's bad news because that puts you in a position where you are personalising things and you are potentially veering towards defamation. I can't comment on what is and isn't defamation because I am not a legal practitioner. You'd always need to seek legal advice on that.
When you've got a majority of owners that are investors and they don't live at the scheme, how do you lobby in that situation?
I think again, you get their contact details from the roll. So it always starts by getting the body corporate roll and then the contact details. I think if you've got a significant number of interstate or overseas owners at your scheme and you happen to be living there, so I'll assume the person asking the question lives there, I think you need to just ever so slightly rejig your approach, and you just need to contextualize it. So remember, if you're reaching out to people who live interstate and overseas, chances are they know next to nothing about Strata. So you've got to really simplify things in that case. So you start with your introduction, and then you start with why it is that you're reaching out, but you're probably going to have to contextualize it a little bit and say, look, you may not be aware of this, but once you're an owner in Queensland, then you are part of this thing called the body corporate, and we make all of these decisions jointly at meetings. That includes spending, blah, 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 blah. I've got one specific issue I'm a little concerned about, and I think it's relevant to you as well. So it's about knowing who your audience is, Nikki, whether they're interstate owners, whether they're owners from a non-English speaking background largely. So if your scheme is comprised largely of owners from a non-English speaking background, I know that happens sometimes, you'll need to think really carefully about how you approach those particular owners. Is there a particular method of communication that that group of owners might be better suited to? You need to have a good think about that. But it all starts with knowing who it is that you're dealing with. You need to know that.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And I guess if they're not living at the building, they may not even be aware of the problem either. So you'd have to contextualize the problem that's happening and give them some background around that as well.
Absolutely.
How does one access the strata role of lot owners? That's a little bit out of the scope of today's session, but approach the committee, Chris?
Yeah, so yeah, again, from a Queensland perspective, if you are an owner, you are entitled to body corporate records, which includes the owner's role. Some of that might already be online as part of the owner's portal, if you're part of an owner's portal. If it is not, then you make a formal written request to the committee, and that will usually be via the body corporate manager. You be very clear about what it is that you are requesting. In Queensland, there will be a fee payable for that. It's a fee per page. It's a very small fee per page. And in Queensland, you are entitled to be given that information within 7 days. That's how it goes.
Okay, thank you. And is lobbying as applicable in smaller schemes when everyone knows each other as it is in larger schemes?
I think it is, but it might be slightly different how it's done. So it might be a bit more of a personal approach in a smaller scheme. I will say to people, though, the vast majority of the worst issues that I deal with either in this business that I run or as commissioner were small schemes, always. Duplexes, triplexes, six packs. Why? Because the tendency is that more people will live there. Also because you see everybody all the time and you know people all the time. So there is much more chance that you can develop more personal relationships, which I think is actually contrary to what you should be attempting to achieve. I do not remember how many duplex related clients I have on my books at the moment, Nikki. And in every case, there is an element of persuasion. It's a very different kind of persuasion to what I have been talking about today, but it's still persuasion. There is one owner attempting to persuade the other owner about something. And in most cases, it's a very, very challenging way of doing things. Very.
Our committee has remained relatively unchanged for quite some time. This year, however, several new nominees have been added. Now that change is in the air, is it best to lobby as a group or as an individual? And what are the pros and cons of each strategy?
That's a really good question. I don't know if one is better or worse than the other. You'd have to base it upon where things are at the building. I know that some people would look at the idea of, multiple changes on a committee perhaps a bit negatively. They'd see that as unnecessary change or a bit disruptive, perhaps. So you've got to bear that in mind. So if I'm not saying don't do it, I'm saying keep that in mind and make sure your lobbying message reflects that. And the obvious lobbying message there is time for a fresh start, time for a fresh pair of eyes. As a group, it's kind of like having a ticket, isn't it? That word ticket that's used in politics a lot. So you hear about the leadership ticket. So the leadership ticket in America is Harris and Waltz, I think his name is. So that's the ticket that's being put forward. So Instead of promoting or voting for an individual, you are promoting and seeking votes for a team or a concept. And I think it's a little easier to promote a concept when you have a team than it is for an individual. So at your strata scheme, if you are wanting to do something a bit differently, there's a big issue that you want to push forward at your scheme, easier for 3 nominees to present that as a joint concept than it is for one person to do so. Then again, it might only be one person that really needs to be on the committee or needs to be changed. So think about it that way. If you are putting it forward as a group, and I've got a client at the moment who's putting forward a ticket of preferred nominees, you're going to have to go into a bit of detail, I think, about what those nominees offer, why you're putting them forward. And that might be biographies, it might be making them available, which involve a bit of coordination. So you have to remember it's just going to take a little bit more work because you're coordinating, you're trying to herd more cats, basically. Bear that in mind. For larger buildings, the ticket approach is probably going to work. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Is it ethical to target owners or voters who you feel will swing to your point of view, say via an email, or should you email all owners to demonstrate an open and transparent approach to your lobbying?
I'd probably email all, but what you need to do if you're the lobbyist is to make sure that you know who's on your side and who's not. So you need to know who's likely to vote yes, who's likely to vote no, and who you just aren't sure of. And again, that's just crunching the numbers from a political perspective. But to the original question, yeah, I see benefit in value in going out there to everybody. I mean, if you already know people are going to vote for you, then there's no harm in sending that out. So then really what your focus is on is those no voters and those uncertain voters in that case. The complication there is that you might need slightly different messages for those 2 groups. If you've got adamant no voters who are violently opposed to whatever it is that you want, you might have to do a little bit more work in relation to them than you would for an unknown or an uncertain group.
And we've spoken about lobbying in small strata schemes. So let's go the other end. If you're in a really large layered scheme, how do you lobby in that situation?
Again, we start out by knowing who it is that you're dealing with, understanding the differences. So in a layered scheme, each of those subsidiaries might have a different focus or a different issue. So much the better if everyone's got the same concern, then you just got one message. But it may well be that one subsidiary is focused on one issue while another subsidiary has a completely different concern. So understand the differences, take the temperature. And then, yeah, it's the same as everything else. Get your messaging right and focus upon that. Slightly different in a layered scheme, subject to whether or not you're lobbying for, say, positions on the principal or positions on the subsidiary. So that might be slightly different in that respect. But again, it's about understanding what each of those parties may need or want in the process.
What persuasive techniques are recommended to change the language, attitude, or bias of a body corporate in perceiving lot owner concerns as objections and complaints?
Yeah, that's a tough one, isn't it? Because sometimes I know that happens from a committee perspective. They feel like they're doing what they're supposed to do and they're doing a decent job, and yet they're getting complaints coming in. I'd say that you shouldn't be afraid of complaints or negative feedback. What's that old saying? The worst thing, no, there's no such thing as bad publicity. I think that kind of applies here as well. If people are giving you negative feedback, well, at least they're engaged. So that's good. If they are giving you negative feedback, though, then, and this is a bit confronting, Nikki, then why are they giving you negative feedback? Is there a reason they're giving you negative feedback? I mean, and particularly if the feedback is the same every time, you're not listening to us, that tells me there's something amiss there. So don't ignore it. Take it on board, use it as an opportunity for development. But if it's vindictive or completely off topic, not even remotely connected to reality, then you get into the position of whether or not you actually have to respond to that or whether you just let that go.
So can the committee send correspondence to lot owners stating vote guidance, vote for us, and pre-fill out voting papers leading up to the AGM under a commercial module in Queensland to influence committee elections? And I know you spoke about this quickly during the presentation, and we get lots of questions about that as well.
Look, the short answer is yes, they can. The longer answer is they need to be awfully careful about how they're doing that, though. What the committee needs to avoid is it needs to avoid the impression that there is only one way to vote. And they, number one, and number two, they want to avoid being seen to be misleading people. So a really quick example, I had a client recently who provided me a copy of the AGM materials. And in the AGM materials were the voting papers, so that was fine. And I looked at the voting papers and all the yeses were bolded in that voting paper. Nothing else was bolded or underlined or italicized, only the yeses. And my client thought, is that fair? And I have to say, I'm not sure that it is, to tell you the truth, because what that is essentially saying it could be argued, and this has certainly been the subject of applications to adjudicators in the past, could be argued that it's being suggested to owners there's only one way that you can vote here. There's only one legitimate way that you can vote. So be really careful, committee, about how you can absolutely recommend people vote for something. It's just how you do it. It's always about how you do it. Don't mislead and don't be seen to be depriving people of a choice, because that's what it is at the end of the day. This is a democracy. You're going out there, you're trying to get people to do what you want. You've got to accept that you might fail. That's the reality.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, well, that brings us up to the end of the session. So as always, we'd just like to check back in and say, is there any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with as we wrap everything up?
If you try it, then at least you might get some success out of this. If you don't try lobbying, you don't actually know if you'll get anything.
Hopefully you learned something interesting from the session that will positively affect your experience in your strata scheme. If you gained value from this video, please hit like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're looking for information about parking, strata insurance, defects and more, head over to lookupstrata.com.au or sign up to our free weekly newsletter via the link in the description box below.